Hello and welcome to the spring 2023 edition of Talos IR On Air. Today we'll be recapping the findings and takeaways from Talos Incident Response engagements that closed during the first quarter of 2023. As a reminder, the information we're discussing today is available on the Talos blog as part of our quarterly threat trends report. You can find that report at blog.talosintelligence.com. I'm Craig Jackson, a senior incident response consultant with Talos Incident Response, and I'm joined today by three members of our incident response and threat intelligence community. Before we start talking about the trends and the report itself, I'd like to give each member of the team an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do at Talos. So Jacob, I'm going to turn it over to you to start with.
Great. Hi, everyone. Jacob Finn. I'm with Talos's threat intelligence and interdiction team. And my role and our group, we're responsible for looking at the cyber threat landscape and assessing what that impact is to Talos's customers and our partners moving forward.
Thank you, Jacob. Joe?
Hi, my name is Joe Schumacher. I'm an incident commander within Talos Incident Response. So my main focus is mostly on emergency response, leading our engagements with a team of consultants. Also assisting on some proactive measures, playbooks, plans, threat assessments, things of that nature.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. And last but not least, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Albert. I'm one of the senior managers on the Talos Incident Response team. My job is what you would expect a manager's job to be. Is I help enable our amazing incident responders, make sure they have the tools and training they need and processes they need to help our customers out. I also meet with customers, help supervise delivery of our incident response services, and a bunch of other manager-related tasks like improving time cards and whatnot. Very exciting.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, guys, for taking the time to be here today. Before we actually start talking kind of the nitty-gritty of the report, for any first-time viewers or anyone who hasn't read one of our quarterly reports before, Jacob, can you kind of give an overview of how that information is organized and what's usually included in each report?
Sure. So the goal of these quarterly trend assessments is to take a strategic level look at the types of threats we're observing each quarter, which we believe are indicative of the broader cyber threat landscape. We break it down into 4 or so main parts. We first look at what the top threat is for the quarter, whether that's a specific type of malware, a threat group or actor, or a type of tool. The second part is the initial infection vectors that enable these threats to be successful. So that might be something like phishing or exploitation of vulnerable public-facing infrastructure. The third thing we look at are the actions that threat actors are taking post-compromise. So activities like traversing networks, escalating privileges, stealing and exfiltrating information from the environment. And then finally, after looking at all of these things together, we also assess what were the top security weaknesses on the defender side. And then we provide recommendations for moving forward as well.
And we'll be discussing we'll cover all those points today during the broadcast as kind of a Cliff Notes version of the quarterly threat trends report. So we've got the overview. Now, having read the report myself and also discussing with the other members of the team, we had some unique, if not unexpected, findings. Do you want to provide kind of a high level before we go into each one of these items individually?
Sure. So to start it off, I'd say one of the pretty notable trends we observed was an increase in the use of web shells to compromise web servers. We observed this in about a quarter of all of the cases, and that was a significant increase from last quarter. This also coincided with exploitation of public-facing applications, which was also the top initial access vector this quarter. We saw exploitation of public-facing applications in about half of all the incidents we responded to. And the high web shell usage likely contributed to this, as adversaries were attempting to use exploits to take advantage of poorly managed or patched systems and internet-facing applications. Other initial access methods included adversaries leveraging compromised or stolen credentials, either using valid accounts with weak passwords, as well as compromising systems that were only using one method of authentication. Another notable finding has to do with the number of ransomware incidents we responded to. The number slightly decreased, but this is partly due to the fact that we are still actively investigating a couple of ransomware cases that opened up last quarter. And it also doesn't take into account the number of incidents we consider pre-ransomware engagements. So this is basically where the actor is conducting many post-compromise activities like lateral movement and escalating privileges, but we never actually see any type of ransomware detonation or encryption of files or networks. But when we combine both of the ransomware incidents and so the number of ransomware incidents and pre-ransomware planning incidents, we see a very consistent trend as we've seen in previous quarters.
So it was kind of more about timing of when the report was developed and some of the other activity around that it was a caveat to the decrease in the ransomware for the quarter. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Ransomware actors are still incredibly active.
Gotcha. And the web shells, the initial access and the web shell usage for the quarter, that was one of the biggest surprises to me. And I was even involved in one of the incidents, but I didn't realize that it was an ongoing trend until I read the report. Joe, I understand that you were one of the incident commanders that handled at least one, if not a few, of those web shell cases. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Can you give us some insights or some findings from each one of those engagements?
Yeah, be glad to. So I personally think web shells are a tricky little tool that can be used by adversaries, and it can be hard to find. So typically, a web shell is going to be placed on a web server to interact with the underlying operating system and then move from there, whether to escalate on that machine and raise privilege or look to move from there. Getting a little bit of a flashback from that quarter, because we did have quite a few web shells. We saw them across different customers that were not necessarily related, and some that actually targeted or tied back to what we thought or what we've identified as persistent threats. So it was quite an interesting time, and we did see it both from kind of a defacement side, but also from different ways of getting into it. So we saw some that had misconfigured permissions, allowing file uploads with execution on those uploads. And we also saw things like SQL injection attacks that actually used the SQL injection to put in a web shell. So, and these web shells, you can find them pretty much everywhere. Just a quick search on GitHub can get you quite a bit of fun things to play with.
And I saw there was some variability with the web shells from the report as well. We were talking a single web shell that was full featured, had a bunch of different functions or mechanisms integrated into one single file, whereas others were separated out by function, and the adversary had uploaded 3 to 5 different web shells just to accomplish their end goal. Is that kind of what you experienced with your engagements as well?
100%. Usually when you find one web shell, there's going to be another on the same machine. And in this situation, we did see specific uses of web shells. So things that were on a web server that allowed interaction with the backend database. So they had a web shell that specifically allowed commands to go through to that web server and hit the backend database. We also saw web shells that would actually call back out in ways as well. So it's almost like a C2 or a command and control platform, and not just something that the adversary is interacting with directly.
Absolutely. And not just the web shells, but just the public facing, the access, unauthorized access of public facing infrastructure in general. Almost 50% of our engagements involving a component of that being the initial access vector. That's pretty alarming. So Matthew, if I can ask you, taking web shells as a component of this, but then looking at it from the broader sense of initial access through a public facing application, what can organizations do to prevent that? What can we do to reverse that trend and kind of knock that number back down to a lower percentage?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we sometimes run into, or fairly often run into, is that customers don't really actually know what they have publicly facing. They think they know, but there may be some application that's not being actively managed, or is being operated by a business unit to support some specific function, and they're not even aware that this application is public facing to begin with. And so the first step, to be honest, in any security program, whether you're talking about your internal assets or externally facing, is to start with an inventory of those. You can do that by doing scans of your externally facing IP addresses or your IP address space, and identify, servers or whatnot that might be posted. Also, as part of that scan, you can see what applications are being hosted on those, and follow those up with vulnerability scans, where you find vulnerabilities that are exploitable, patch them, and expedite that patching. And then also web application firewalls, right? Web application firewalls should always be sitting in front of any web application you're hosting, or any publicly facing application, and make sure that you're filtering content there, right? And then, one thing that we find sometimes, customers will have their public facing applications breached, and the adversary uses that authentication mechanism to pivot deeper into the network, where the customer didn't segment that authentication mechanism. And so they're using the same Active Directory authentication for their public facing applications they are using for users to VPN in or to access critical business functions. Those should be separated, right? And then lastly, where you can, enforce multi-factor authentication for any remote access. I know that's, not all public facing applications you can do that with. If you have users accessing or customers accessing, and that might be challenging. But where possible, enforce multi-factor authentication.
And that ties into something that Jacob said during his overview. Wasn't multi-factor authentication a component of what your findings were, Jacob?
Yeah, it was the top security weakness that we observed for this past quarter. Many of the incidents we observed could have been prevented had MFA been enabled.
Yeah, I'll just say that's been a trend going on for years. That's not a new trend. Is that MFA can go a long ways to minimizing your risk exposure. It's obviously not a magic wand, but it should definitely be part of your security program. So
properly configured MFA, right?
That's a good, yes,
you can't
absolutely.
just turn it on and leave it unconfigured. You actually have to get it done right.
Yep.
Absolutely. So another of the interesting findings that we had from the report was a point that law enforcement has made such strides since the beginning of the year with disrupting adversary activity and making sure that infrastructure is unavailable for adversaries to use. We also saw a situation where some ransomware groups were disrupted. We've seen other types of law enforcement activity as well. But it brings up an important point. How will this change the trends, and how will this change the way adversaries act throughout the remainder of the year, with things like ransomware being taken offline, the Genesis market takedown as well will have impacts. So I'd like this to be a group discussion, but Jacob, I'm going to start with you just to get your insights to see how is this going to impact us for the rest of the year in terms of the threat landscape?
Yeah, so the operation you were referring to was an FBI takedown this past January of the Hive ransomware group. Hive is a cyber criminal group. It was first spotted around mid-2021, operating in what's called a ransomware as a service model, meaning that the developers of Hive would create and maintain the ransomware while independent affiliates, other cyber criminals, would conduct the ransomware attacks themselves. Then Hive then received some portion of the victim ransom payments. Hive was a pretty high threat group. had targeted hundreds of victims around the world, including governments, critical infrastructure, telecommunications, and even like the healthcare sector. And so in this operation, the FBI stated that they had captured Hive's decryption keys and ultimately being able to protect victims who were under attack. I do think ultimately that in the short term, there will be some impact. But the problem is ransomware groups are notorious for regrouping and reforming under new ransomware operations, different names and affiliations. And I think, unfortunately, the takedown now, not only by government, but we've also seen private sector takedowns. They help in the short term, but I think network defenders really do need to pay attention as we move forward, and they can't let their guard down because these groups do reform.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with Jacob, right? Is that, when these sorts of changes and tactics and tools occur every so often, and it's a bit of a transition period for incident responders because we got to get used to some new tool or some new tactic that's going to be at the end of this. But the adversaries are going to come back, and they'll just be using a different ransomware and a different TTPs and whatnot, and that's part of the job. That's what makes it exciting. But obviously, we just need to be on the ball there, right? So.
I would agree as well, but I also think there's another element that I'm hoping is out there that's maybe not being necessarily talked about, and that's the intelligence side, right? So every time we take down, and we as the collective good people take down these ransomware actors or bad actors or threat adversaries, hopefully we are putting some kind of doubt in their mind of trusting the people around them, right? Because they've gotten compromised and they're offline now. Also, as new ones come up, I'm hoping that we're learning things about those connections, right? And then hopefully those things can be passed down through public-private connections, and threat intelligence teams can learn about that and get ahead a little bit of the tools of the TTPs that are out there.
So what I'm hearing is that this is something we love to see. We want to be celebrating this, but in a way it's going to continue to be whack-a-mole, and the network defenders, that we can't lose the vigilance that we have maintained over the years. We need to keep that going, if not increase that, because there's just going to be additional attacks and additional concerns.
Very true.
So I want to leave some time at the end for Q&A. I know we're going to have some questions from the audience about a lot of these topics and the findings from the report, but I do want to move into our next segment, which is our dumpster fire segment. And this is when we give a member of our panel an opportunity to vent a little bit about a concern or something that they've seen within the work that we do, and kind of our interface with our customers and the security community as a whole. It is not just complaining, though. Please don't think we're complaining. This is an opportunity for us to share something with the community that we want to emphasize and we want to bring to light to hopefully get addressed by the community. So, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you for dumpster fire.
All right, reluctant, thank you, I guess. And to that point, we do try to have empathy. We understand that these situations and our gripes or our worries, you have a lot going on, right? Operations and different things. So today, my gripe or my dumpster fire is EDR, endpoint protection, and not just the product itself, but configuring the product, whatever product you choose, making sure that you have things like blocking enabled, right? Not just audit and alerting, taking advantage of behavioral factors that you can use, not just signature scanning of files. But that's really a big thing. Most of the stuff that we see in responding to incidents is not 0 days, it's known. And if the tools are configured in a way, we can do something a lot better than mopping up a ransomware and try to help you get ahead of that curve. So we understand that there's a big battle with EDR. Security software for years has been a battle with IT in the business, right? This is draining our resources. This is blocking something that's legitimate. I've been trying to coin a phrase. It's, there's the difference between the 5 nines and the 3 A's. So IT is really focused about uptime and anything that they can do to make sure resources are available. Our area is on the 3 A's, so authentication, authorization, and accounting. So we need to find that balance, and we need to make sure that EDR tools are kind of getting more to those 3 A's and realizing that these products have been around for a long time, and the resource strain is not the same as it was in the early 2000s. So I'll try to get off my soapbox, but it is something that's really, really important is your EDR solutions, is that next-gen AV type protection. All back to you, Craig.
And I think one of the big takeaways from that in our discussions leading up to this conversation today, and frankly, just being involved in incident response in general, is audit mode versus active response with EDR. Because I don't know what your experience has been, but hearing customers distraught that they've invested in these tools and they've taken the time to set them up, but then an adversary still gains access or they still have an incident, and they come to find out that everything's just watching. It's not actually responding. It's in audit mode. Is that something that you feel like you see pretty frequently as well?
It definitely is. And then to add that aspect as well, most of these products allow you to do a connector password. So you can't just uninstall it if you have an admin access to that account or to that machine. So getting things into a blocking mode, a quarantine blocking mode, and making sure that that tool can't be uninstalled by someone who's not supposed to be doing that.
Absolutely. And using that as a segue, moving into our service highlight, Matthew, I think Talos Incident Response has at least a few different services we offer that can help with that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't I start off though by level setting a bit about, because I don't know how many of the viewers even are sure what an incident response retainer is, right? So let's talk a bit about what an incident response retainer is, what sort of customers might want an incident response retainer, and what those services are within Talos's incident response retainer that could help out, right? So firstly, an incident response retainer is a digital forensics incident response subscription that customers usually will purchase on an annual basis. That comes with a pool of hours that can be used, if you need to call Joe, for example, to come in and help you resolve an incident, right? That team, that incident response team, will usually join your incident response efforts and help identify likely root causes of the incident and to provide recommendations on how to remediate it. Many mid to small customers lack the resources to have a fully staffed digital forensic team, and so having a retainer service will help assist with that when they do have, or if they have, an incident. And even some of our mid to large companies that do have an incident response team in-house only have a limited number of individuals on hand, and they don't respond to nearly as many incidents as we do over in Talos IR. And so being able to leverage our services to help provide that experience goes a long way. And so, what makes our service maybe a little unique is that in addition to the subscription that you get for that emergency service, you can also leverage the retainer for a whole number of other proactive services, all delivered by our same incident responders that do that digital forensics and incident response piece. So, for example, let's say we have a customer who reaches out to us and they want to have a tabletop exercise performed. Well, that tabletop exercise is going to be delivered by people like Joe and Craig and all the other great members of our IR team who, in between responding to incidents and doing forensics, they get to go and leverage that experience to provide your organization with a realistic scenario, tabletop exercise scenario, to test how your organization might respond if there were to be an incident, right? That's it at a high level. Are there any specific questions you want me to dig into, Craig?
So we have a situation here where we're talking, we've talked a lot today about access of public-facing infrastructure. We've talked about web shells. Joe raised some really great concerns about EDR. What do you think, or what would you recommend to customers hearing these concerns about what service would you recommend to address those items?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends, right? If the customer has an EDR solution already in place, probably one of our first recommendations would be to engage in a compromise assessment and a review of the evidence that's being collected by that EDR solution. As an extension of that, we will often dip into the configuration to see what it's not a configuration check service, but just by the nature of what it is, we'll likely look at those sorts of things as well. We also have, well, it's not on the menu, I'm going to throw it out there anyways. We do have some other services that we're building up to help support those sorts of functions in our assessments. We have a readiness assessment that we have on the menu, and we have a new service that's in the oven that's being baked called a log architecture assessment. I don't think I was supposed to drop that on here, but I did it anyways, and it's too late. And so when that comes and that's ready to go, I think that would also help a lot with that specific question about not just is my ADR being configured properly, but am I ingesting these logs and am I getting the right information out of it, right? If you don't mind too, I want to talk a bit about what the retainer service includes for Talos IR. If you don't mind me chatting a bit about that. So one of the things is all of our incident response services come with service level objectives for emergency response at 4 hours by phone. If you pay for a certain number of hours or a certain level of service, you also get travel that could be included in that as well. And if you do have travel included, we have a 24-hour in transit service level objective as part of that service, right? If customers who have 50 hours or more on their retainer can leverage that menu of proactive services that we saw previously, all of our customers have access to our core emergency response and intel on demand service. But if you have additional hours that are sufficient, you can also leverage that for planning, training, hunting, simulating through our red team capabilities and whatnot, right?
Absolutely. So plenty of opportunities to address these concerns. And it sounds like based on your sneak peeks at some of our upcoming services, there will be more in the future, right?
Absolutely. No, we're always improving our service and taking customer feedback and feedback from our consultants and saying, hey, what works, what doesn't work, what customers are asking for, and how do we get that into the retainer to add more value to it as well, right?
Outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of customer feedback, thank you, Matthew. We have time for a couple quick questions here before we have to sign off for the day. One of the questions that came in from the audience was, sounds like web shells got a lot of attention this corner. Were those seen primarily on a specific OS or multiple OS? So are we seeing exploitation of Linux, Windows, Mac? What are we seeing here?
From my memory, it was mainly Windows. So it was IIS servers. But we did see different code variants of our web shells and different. They weren't all necessarily created equal. So we saw web shells that were as few as 3 or 4 lines that were written in PHP, and we saw a mammoth web shell that was, I think, nearly 1,800 lines of code that did a whole bunch of stuff. So it really was targeted at this time from my side was Windows, but it's not so much the OS as much as what is the web server, and then it's how do we run that code at the web server and then interact with the underlying operating system.
Got it. Thank you, Joe.
Go
ahead, Jacob.
I was just going to add that a lot of the web shells we did see were publicly sourced from GitHub code repositories. So adversaries will typically go there and find publicly available code.
Take advantage of what's available, right? Absolutely. So we have one other question that came in that we have time for here.
Yeah.
And I think this one's directed at Joe. How can companies test whether their EDR is properly configured? Everyone thinks their EDR is fine until something happens. So what proactive steps can companies take to address that?
Well, I wouldn't just go drop malicious files in your machine and see what happens, right? We don't want to just open up phishing emails and say, let's test our EDR solution. But there are some things that we can think about. So Matt mentioned a couple, right, already. The things that I would kind of think about as well is a penetration test. When you're doing one, EDR can play a role into that. Don't turn it off. Don't give the red team an easy way, right? I think one of the things that's more gaining traction to test this is things like purple teaming, where you're taking that blue mindset and the red mindset and kind of meshing them together so we can do controlled adversary executions on an endpoint in a manner that we know is not going to be dangerous to the environment. And then we can look at what was caught, what was alerted, what was flagged, what was blocked, and then we can kind of get a better sense of what we have. Lastly, coming from a Cisco perspective, I've been in a few different roles within this company. So I know we have health checks through customer success teams. So things like reaching out to your account manager and saying, hey, I'd like to get EDR session with secure endpoint, and have you get a good look at operational and configurations of that can mean a big difference between us kind of mopping up something or us kind of seeing things blocked. It's really a big difference there.
Matthew, do you have anything you want to add to that as well?
I was just going to say, I was going to mention the health check. So awesome, Joe. And I would just say that if you're using a different product other than a Cisco product, reach out to that vendor. They probably have a similar sort of service as well. Read the documentation, follow up on it, right? Make sure, double check. If you haven't looked at your configs in a while, maybe after this webcast, go check them out, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. So we are out of time for today. We had a great conversation. I appreciate everyone who took part in the broadcast today. And I also want to thank all of the individuals from Talos Intelligence and Talos Incident Response that put together these reports and make this possible for us. We greatly appreciate it. We will be back mid-summer to recap Q2 of 2023. In the meantime, please continue to check blog.talosintelligence.com for additional research and updates related to the topics that we've covered today. So thank you all for attending, and we will look forward to seeing you later this summer.